Divine trust. It could be said that he gave words their due, meticulously protecting them as if they were a sacred trust. We couldn't have imagined that the seemingly ordinary conversation of that day would delve so deeply into the subject, leaving us breathless. Our elderly professor, as always, began by drawing us into the dusty pages of history with his personal interests.
I had an immature idea that our ancestors had lived in a caste-like cultural lifestyle, trapped within a rather rigid mold imposed by force. However, some social historians' assessments of earlier periods raised doubts about the accuracy of this unhealthy idea. The existence of wealthy families, the city's notables, regarding the social structure's resistance to change, were always inexplicable to me. From the second half of the 18th century onwards, the administration managed the situation for almost 75 years by enlisting the help of the city's elite in collecting state revenues as a solution to its helplessness. The central government's sharing of power with local administrations, strangely enough, also paved the way for democracy. However, this policy was essentially a policy adopted solely to save the day. The infighting among the notables was of little concern to the central government. The Waqf system, touted as a source of pride and the raison d'etre of our civilization, largely prevented the central government from seizing the wealth of the rich. People, by legally controlling the income from the charitable works they had endowed, could secure their own futures. In other words, the government in a sense compelled people to take ownership of the land they lived on. Amidst centuries of accumulated administrative weaknesses, one day a ruler emerged, seizing the reins and attempting to radically alter the course of the country's backward history. He strengthened central authority by eliminating the problematic local administrations one by one. However, the country was a sick man whose wealth was to be divided. Despite this, the administration continued to exist for almost another century, gradually weakening day by day. About a century ago, the new regime, rising from the ashes, acknowledged the eternal contribution of the wealthy to the governance of the country and sought to give them a role. Governments consistently supported the growth of these families through tax exemptions, customs protections, credit facilities, and public banks. However, since private sector capital accumulation was weak in those years, it would take time for this entrepreneurial spirit to effectively come into service.
It was difficult to predict where this multi-layered historical introduction would lead. It was likely a shift towards the, quote, social role of the private sector, which is not particularly relevant to our field of interest.
Today, to use an analogy, the motto of the legendary head of one of these families, who possessed virtually an army of workers, was, in a Napoleonic style, work, work, work. However, his philosophy was distinctly American. His humility, integrated with the people, was evident in his sharing lunches with his workers. The founder of the family was a self-taught individual, or in other words, someone who learned the trade through experience. He had learned in the school of life. But the second and third generations, without exception, had received a high-quality education. They followed not only the conditions of the country, but also the international business world. As you know, inheritance disputes are common in our culture, stemming from the mentality of, better to have little than nothing, but let it be mine. However, acting as a whole, without division, will bring strength. His children managed to act together and, 50 years after the founding, became one of the largest companies in the country. However, only one of the brothers left, taking his share, due to the bureaucratic inefficiency of the company structure that hindered quick decision-making.
He paused just to catch his breath. In the meantime, he glanced at the now quite cold teacup in front of him. That's all. But none of us, out of courtesy to avoid prolonging the break, rushed to refill the cup. He continued where he left off.
The son of this separatist entrepreneur married one of the daughters of another holding company owner. At first glance, this marriage could hastily be called a, quote, corporate marriage. However, the two companies were operating in completely different lanes, and the bride, thanks to her high level of education, worked as a senior executive in her father's flagship from beginning to end. The story of the sinking of this ship confronts us with the pain of the country's lost years. How can one not remember Hobbes' bellum omnium contra omnes, meaning the war of all against all? The captain of this ship, one of the second-generation wealthy of the regime, was seen by some as a figure who brought institutionalism and technology to the press. By others, he was a representative of the established order who used the power of the media for his commercial interests. But one thing is certain, with his withdrawal from the media world after 40 years, the sector began to return. It underwent an irreversible structural change. The boss of headlines, the prince of the plaza, and the showman of the stages, who once held the pulse of the nation, now stand as symbols of an era full of power, noise, and shadow. Heroes of a period that evokes a bitter feeling when remembered, but one too harsh to relive.
Then our old friend moved on to the story of a tragicomic era that we young people cannot possibly remember. Frankly, it was a period where we couldn't quite predict where to laugh and where to frown.
In the past, media moguls only owned newspapers/TV stations. From that time on, media generally became small subsidiaries of much larger industrial holdings. And, as if it were natural, a war with no winner immediately began between them. In those years, the rivalry between the headline boss and the Prince of the Plaza reached such an unbelievable level that newspapers began giving away plates, dishes, encyclopedias, even televisions and cars with coupons. This war is also considered the beginning of the media's transformation from its primary duty of reporting to a commercial monster. However, it wasn't the media that brought about the prince's downfall, but banking. When the state seized his bank during a sectoral crisis, his media empire collapsed like dominoes. He was forced to withdraw from the scene with a resounding roar. While it may seem like an absurd comedy film today, the Plaza Wars in press history were actually a struggle for the sharing of immense power. Newspapers were used not to report news, but to undermine rival bosses. One morning you would open Özgürlük and see the prince's irregularities in his banking dealings. The next day, when you opened Safak, you would be faced with headlines in large print about the headline boss's paper smuggling activities. Headlines like scoundrel, thief, and traitor were flying around everywhere. It was the bosses, not the editors, who were actually speaking.
In this interesting period, where the agenda was shaped by the struggles among the journalists themselves, it almost seemed as if the real events were being covered up. It was as if those were years when collective discernment was clouded.
Instead of exploiting the public's interest in news, their urge to buy goods was exploited. At one point, things got so out of hand that newspapers started giving away juicers, televisions, and cookware sets with 10 to 15 coupons every day. Once, when a competitor offered a juicer, the other launched a campaign saying, "We're giving away both a juicer and a fruit basket." During this period, the public, who used to say, "Don't tell me to read books," ended up with the world's largest encyclopedia archive. But journalism suffered a serious loss of credibility. The press, chasing after pot lids instead of news, lost its prestige amidst the coupons. When the stage showman entered this battle, his style became even harsher. His newspaper gave the headline boss nicknames like Tax Evader and the Prince Bank Emptier. Moreover, unlike its competitors, his newspaper was sold at a much lower price and blended full-page nude female photographs with harsh political attacks. On the other hand, the relationship between politics and the media was a complete give and take. Politicians in the capital knew they couldn't win elections without the support of media moguls. And media moguls knew they couldn't get huge contracts in energy, banking, and privatization without the permission of politicians. Like all wars, this senseless war would give way to other wars. Perhaps a tombstone inscription could only reflect the truth this much. The illusion of ending is broken in the endless cycle of the Ouroboros.
At this point in the conversation, our old friend was about to finish one story and start another, I think. However, it would have been more humorous if he had given the example of a cat that spins around chasing its tail and doesn't understand what happened when it bites it, instead of a snake or a dragon.
The Prince of the Plaza collapsed along with his bank during the economic crisis. The showman of the stage, by directly entering politics and amassing a growing following through sandwiches and concerts in public squares, became a target when he insisted on becoming prime minister. His companies were politically seized. He too found salvation in exile by leaving the country at the first opportunity. The boss of the headlines, on the other hand, always chose to play the game as a, quote, power behind the scenes. That is, he tried to remain a focal point to be compromised, not a direct rival. But ultimately, he too suffered the inevitable fate, tax penalties, and the sale of his media outlets.
Behind the subtly ironic tone, the story resembled a chain of former governments, a tangled web of a nation's 40-knot fate. After a short break, our elderly friend moved on from this tragic upheaval to present a distinguished example of his biographical studies.
Our female protagonist received her economics education in Turkey and her media education abroad at one of the top few universities in the world, offering the best education in this field. Upon returning to the country, she immediately took charge of the business, and for a long time, she held senior management positions for many years. Naturally, she served as the vice chairman of the foundation's board of directors and a member of the holdings board of directors. She was also a founding member of an international organization supporting entrepreneurship. The aim of this organization was to support effective entrepreneurs and connect them with a global network of mentors, investors, and entrepreneurs. On the other hand, she was also a member of a voluntary business organization comprised of entrepreneurs and business leaders from the country's leading 4,500 companies. Approximately half of the non-public added value created came from the member companies of this organization. As one of the most powerful business organizations, it contributed to policy development processes in both economic and social fields. She played a pioneering role in the digital transformation of freedom and in social responsibility projects such as End Domestic Violence. In the years following the sinking of the ship, with her multifaceted personality, she focused on sculpture and artworks, exhibiting her works on various platforms.
As far as I know our elderly friend, he would return to this subject, and I think that was the main course on the menu.
I don't think the foundations of her marriage to the grandson of one of the legendary figures in the country's economic history were laid with her acquaintance with him during his student years abroad. The fact that his other siblings also married the children of leading holding company owners in the country seems to fit the definition of a strategic marriage perfectly. She must have been affected by the passing of his elderly father-in-law with his sensitive personality. Perhaps she saw in him a strong quality, a capacity for making difficult decisions on the path to self-realization. I don't know. But after a while, an unexpected event that the family experienced together, I think, had a profound impact on, quote, learning by experience.
Then, our elderly friend suddenly switched to a theatrical tone, with a weak connection that we couldn't immediately understand what he was talking about.
In the middle of the boundless blue, like a door opening to the human soul, a mirror of infinity, or the loneliness in the void that triggers the meaninglessness of nothingness. As the inaccessibility of the sky descends, the depths beneath whisper the fear of the unknown. First, the rhythm of the waves, the direction of the wind, the power of the current make the will aware of its helplessness. And finally, inevitably, it surrenders to its fate. After the fading hum, silence, and the monotony of the waves that occasionally make themselves felt slow down time, he finds himself in the cell of his inner world, where thoughts and fears, suspended on the thin line between life and death, are experienced more intensely. At the same time, the rustling of the waves carries his to a cosmic realm where he is questioned, echoing in the depths of his soul. Here, man realizes his own helplessness in the face of the absolute power of nature. This realization gives rise to both a fear of annihilation and a questioning of the meaning of existence. The world is no longer a boundless realm of freedom. It is a gigantic prison stretching in every direction but leading nowhere. The survivor's soul oscillates between a primal instinct for survival and a peaceful surrender. That moment of helplessness in the middle of the open sea shows how fleeting everything a person thinks he possesses actually is. That being, at the mercy of the waves, realizes in the vast emptiness that his body and breath are not his property, but a trust to be protected. Life is no longer seen as a chance success. It begins to be seen as a blessing and a trust. When he realizes he is as small as a grain of sand in the universe, he understands that the only thing left in his possession is that trembling breath entrusted to him. Entrusted is no longer just an object we must protect. It is a right to life, to be reaffirmed with every breath, a right that can be reclaimed at any moment.
I confess, I can't say I'm glad, somewhat surprisingly, that we escaped the suffocating effects of that state of mind we were caught in.
This accident brought the truth that life and body are a trust to the forefront in a very striking way. In interviews given during his recovery process, the artist stated that this extreme event brought him back to his essence and made him question his priorities again. The exhibition was the first public appearance after the serious accident he suffered with his family, which confined him to bed for months. This added a more emotional and impactful depth to the exhibition, as the perspective of an artist who personally experienced the truth that life is a trust. For him, trust meant seeing the land, the water, the words, and most importantly, each other's stories as trusts. When you take something as a trust, you don't own it, you only become its guardian.
However, to explain the meaningful connections he made between seemingly unrelated events, with his vast references, solely through our elderly friend's intuition, seemed like an oversimplification.
It was as if, by a twist of fate, his father-in-law leaving the family after many years to establish his own company, and his daughter-in-law choosing her own path after many years of marriage, were intertwined. The similarity I drew between them may have been merely a coincidence. I can't really know for sure, but I'm absolutely certain it's intertwined with the concept of trust. While trying to make sense of the trust, it occurred to me at the last moment that his own father, undoubtedly before the transfer of power, had let slip a word of revelation in the celebratory words at the wedding of the female TV anchor who had presented the coup live on television, words that I doubt he had accidentally let slip. It was a word that implied the uprising was a theater, but also maintained the mask of careless utterance due to the garrulousness of old age, a word that was recorded in history. It was as if the task of overthrowing and establishing governments had been entrusted to him about 25 years earlier. And on the day he left the ship as the last person, it was being officially confirmed that this trust had been taken back from him. The man, who was 80 years old when he experienced this, was well aware of this.
Our elderly friend would undoubtedly critique the trust with his usual, multifaceted approach.
However, was what the artist did similar to how the power structure throughout history has used religion as a prop to hollow out this fundamental concept and eliminate individuality? How else could one explain his shift from a matter of faith in life to a secular framework under the guise of art? There is a significant cultural gap between the concept's place in the collective memory of this land and the refined version presented by the artist. The understanding that woman is entrusted to man relegates women not as subjects, but as objects, to be protected, cared for, and over which rights must be asserted. However, the entrustment presented by the artist represents the opposite. It rejects ownership, liberates, and represents a modern secular philosophy where everyone is the protector of their own existence. On the other hand, since the subjects are a trust from God, they are the subjects who must be protected and governed justly in the eyes of the Sultan. This forms the basis of both the religious and secular order in Ottoman political culture. However, the crucial example of betrayal of trust and the mechanical understanding that presents religion only as jurisprudence for maintaining social order, a formalistic manifestation that does not respond to the needs of the human soul, leads to the mistake of directing criticism towards religion as a whole.
Our elderly friend fell into a pensive mood for a while. It was difficult to guess what was coming to mind or what was going through his head. I don't know if he was trying to identify the female artist's motivations, to openly read her soul.
There's a saying in Cyrano de Bergerac, "Tell your beloved you love them without using the words, I love you." Instead of using a direct and exhausted expression, you dance with words around that feeling, transforming love from a concept into an atmosphere. It's as if the artist, without uttering God's name, is mentioning him through his work. However, such a powerful appearance suggests caution when judging. While this subject seems like a very alluring area with the devil leading people astray, sometimes we observers may be piecing together the pieces too perfectly in our minds. Is this really a bad state in trust or an aesthetic choice? When the concept is too powerful, it sometimes traps people within its boundaries. That discomfort probably stems from the process being overly managed. Authenticity often contains a bit of disarray, unplannedness, and rawness. When everything is so aesthetic, so philosophical, and so timed, our minds begin to whisper that it's a strategy.
When he fell silent, I was trying to decipher the meaning of his words. From the furrowed brows of the others, I thought we were experiencing the same mental exhaustion. How could she be so merciless in her criticisms?
While trying to understand this woman, the voice of the devil inside me was telling me that her broad life perspective might not only focus on the concept of trust. It was as if, with our selfish genes, there was no place for a stronger and more dominant, quote, ownership. Ownership is a natural right of man and an extension of his personality. It's not just about possessing an object, it's a way of being. The feeling of "this is mine" drives a person to develop, protect, and make that place productive. Behind the technological and economic leap of the West lies that false, but very powerful desire for security and permanence provided by ownership. Perhaps, as humanity, we need an illusion. Civilization is, to some extent, the work of those who build brick by brick as if they will never die. Yes, it is an illusion, but this illusion provides the energy that builds roads, hospitals, and works of art. Even if the property dies, the legacy lives on. Thus, the sense of ownership transforms into a quest for immortality, passed from the individual to society and the future. This is where foundations come in. They are the art of taking that burning, selfish energy of ownership and transforming it into an eternal trust. They give legal reality to that false permanence of ownership. Even if the owner dies, the property continues to live, bear fruit, and flow. This situation is the most powerful antidote to the disappointment created by the fact that everything is temporary.
While these abstract concepts have counterparts in the real world, they were undoubtedly confusing. If it had been said from the beginning that the conversation that day would turn into a prediction of an understanding for the future, none of us would have given it any credence. The artist's work continued to have an impact.
The decision of a wealthy person to exhibit their works in their hometown, far from the glitz and glamour of big cities, is usually too deep and layered to be explained solely by love of art. This project seems almost like a return home, a project of paying off a debt to the land where one spent their childhood. It shakes the museum hierarchy, monopolized by metropolises. Essentially, this exhibition had content that supported the motivation of going away from the center and, quote, connecting with local values. The endeavor, where emotions and thoughts found expression, included forms woven with silver wires, gigantic sculptural installations, and sound installations. The fact that these works were exhibited in the desolate and powerful geography of the countryside, on a hill overlooking the valley, deepened their impact on people even further. On the other hand, the fact that this museum hosted an exhibition by a name of his profile both reinforced the museum's national and international visibility and provided a strong example that art could be taken beyond the boundaries of big cities.
Sometimes, despite his vast knowledge, he would acknowledge his limitations, implying that he might have made erroneous judgments. Let's admit it, we couldn't decide where this was humility and where it was adherence to objectivity.
Here, I may be attaching too much meaning to the artist's motivation in his choice of location. However, I must admit that in the art world, the choice of location is a message as powerful as the work itself. Choosing a mountain village in the countryside instead of exhibiting in established museums was a conscious manifesto. Memory, a theme of connection and roots, begins to find its expression not amidst concrete structures, but in a landscape where the wind blows, you can feel the scent of the earth, and a millennia-old silence persists. On the other hand, by entrusting his works to this museum in the mountains of the countryside, the artist became integrated into the story of social transformation created by the museum's founding mission. In other words, the exhibition was not just an art event, but a signature of support for the philosophy of that museum. However, by taking his works to a museum on the other side of the country, he gave them a geographical spirit and a, quote, social depth. The journey to the second exhibition space outside the country was not a coincidental exhibition traffic, but a conscious construction of a cultural bridge. By bringing the exhibition to the metropolis, she retold a local story in a universal language. In both venues, the exhibition aimed to take the viewer out of their comfort zone, one through physical distance and the other through intellectual depth. These lands have a story to tell. Moreover, this story belongs to all of humanity. Her choice of the countryside, the mountaintop, was not an act of modesty, but rather an effort to authenticate the meaning she imbued in her work. The overseas location was about this authenticity entering the world's memory.
Exploiting our closeness, I said, I think you're in love with this woman. My elderly professor just turned and looked. That's all.